Миний төлөө эх орн чинь юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуухаас өмнө та өөрөө эх орныхон төлөө юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуу. Young Jargal. Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай де факто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Алишер Али, Евроази Капитал компани гүйцэтгэх захирал ирээд байна.
Евроази Капитал бүсийн гүйцэтгэх захирал Алишер Али, Орос улбаны улс Казахстан, Украин, Узбекистан, Азербайджан, Монгол улсад хөрөнгө оруулалтын менежмент, хөрөнгө оруулалтын банк, хөрөнгө оруулалтын чиглэлээр зөвлөгөө өгөх чиглэлээр ажилласан туршлагатай юм. Тэрээр олон улсын санхүүгийн төв болох Нью-Йорк, Лондон, Цюрих, Сингапур, Хонконгод ажиллаж байсан. Түүний үүсгэн байгуулсан Евроази Капитал бүс нь Сингапур улсад бүртгэлтэй бөгөөд Монгол болон Төв Азийн улс орнуудад хөрөнгө оруулах чиглэлээр ажиллаж байна. Алишер Али Монголын хөрөнгийн биржээр бүртгэлтэй Монголын хөгжлийн нөөц компани удирдах зөвлөлийн гишүүн. Алишер Колумбийн их сургуульд олон улсын харилцааны мастер, Оксфордын их сургуулийн бизнесийн удирдлагын мастерын зэрэг хамгаалжээ.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for coming to our studio.
Welcome.
As a tradition of our program, please introduce yourself shortly. Who are your parents? Why you have decided to be a banker, and how come?
Well, with pleasure. As you said, my name is Alisher Ali. I am originally I come from Uzbekistan. I was born in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, and my aspiration initially was to be scholar, to be focused on history, and therefore I went to Tashkent Institute of Oriental Studies. So I majored in Arabic and the history of Arab countries. However, in the early 90s, with the break of the Soviet Union, there were new opportunities that have emerged. So as a result, I was one of the finalists to join Edmund Muskie Fellowship Program, which was funded by the U.S. Congress, and which allowed me to study at the Columbia University in New York in mid-90s. And so I finished Columbia University with a degree in international affairs, and which then opened for me doors in international banking and finance. And this was, as you may remember, the time when the emerging markets started to become important, and the big investment banks from Wall Street start to hire people with the experience in emerging markets, with the language skills. And so this allowed me to get a job with Credit Suisse, First Boston, and this basically launched my career as an investment banker. And this is my main job, has been my main job for more than 15 years.
How did your parents like it?
My parents obviously were very proud of the career that I made, and I think that our generation should consider ourselves to be very lucky, because of those transformational changes that were brought into our part of the world after the break of the Soviet Union and the emergence of more than dozens of countries. And each of these countries, even though they face different challenges, I think the young generation that I belong to broadly have made it. And
you also have studied at Oxford?
Yes, I did. Yes,
After New York?
After New York, I did a number of years as investment banker around the world, in New York, London, Zurich, Moscow, and then I did MBA at Said Business School at Oxford, and I finished it in 2002.
Wow. What was your first large investment working either with Credit Suisse or with anybody else back to former Soviet Union, any part of it?
Yes, it was with Credit Suisse First Boston. We worked on pioneering transactions involving the Eastern European countries, as they start to emerge in international capital markets. The banks from Eastern Europe start to borrow money to to fund the necessary infrastructure and development in the countries in Eastern Europe. So this was the work that I was working on, arranging syndicated loans, Eurobonds for major corporations and financial institutions in Eastern Europe. After my work with Credit Suisse, I joined the Renaissance Capital in Moscow, and I was at the epicenter of the developments of capital markets in Russia. And as a result, the Renaissance Capital, as you may know, was the leading investment bank in the country. So we were involved in some of the groundbreaking transactions involving privatization, involving attracting foreign direct investment.
You said groundbreaking. What kind of one of the groundbreaking example you can share with us?
Well, I was involved in the deal where Renaissance Capital was an advisor, privatization of Svyaz-Invest, which is the country's largest operator of telecommunication services. And this was back in 1997, and this was the largest privatization
of state-owned property.
State-owned property at $1.8 billion.
What was the result of it, of that transactions?
Well, right now, Svyaz-Invest is a very different company than it used to be. It used to be a former Ministry of Telecommunication, and it had to go through a lot of restructuring. And this privatization was the important step in transformation, a gradual transformation of the company.
Isn't it because that now Russia has very good telecommunication services, good choices, wonderful tariffs?
It is obviously Svyaz-Invest is important member, important player in telecommunication sector. I may also give you another example. We were involved in IPO of Wimpelcom, which was at that time a very small company at the New York Stock Exchange, and this was the first Russian company to be listed in New York Stock Exchange ever.
And is it doing good now?
Yes, well, I remember the time when there were only 10,000 subscribers of Wimpelcom, mostly in Moscow city. If you wanted to be a subscriber, you had to pay $1,000 down payment.
Wow.
Your local calls would cost you $3 a minute.
Oh my!
And now, Wimpelcom, 15 years forward, is a company that has close to 100 million subscribers around the world, and has a market capitalization in many billions of dollars. Yes.
Transnational.
Yes.
How come you end up with Mongolia? Why you came?
It's a very interesting story. I was invited by Euromoney to join and speak at the conference, which was held here in Ulaanbaatar in September 2007. So my first visit to Mongolia was only 3 years ago, and so when I came here, I spent 3 days, and what I saw here was very fascinating. I saw a lot of opportunities, and I guess my experience in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and later in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan, gave me some insights in terms of how Mongolia will develop down the road, because I think it's a part of the evolution process.
From your interviews and certain presentations I had a chance to see, I understand that you have been through these processes in Kazakhstan or Russia and other countries that in certain way we are going to do now.
I think so. I think these countries in generally have similar trends. Obviously, each country has their own particularities in their development. But I think, what you look at in Eastern Europe or Russia or in Central Asia, and you compare that with Mongolia, I think both in terms of opportunities and challenges, these countries that go through the transitional periods, they have the same set of challenges and opportunities. So as a result, I thought this is a very exciting opportunity for me to be involved.
So now, 3 years after, if you were right or not?
I think it was a great choice to focus on Mongolia.
What are you doing in Mongolia, and what is your achievements so far?
Well, what has happened is that we have two business lines in Mongolia. One is fund management business. I was back in January 2008. Only a few months after my first visit to Mongolia, I launched the world's first Mongolia dedicated investment fund. And I was able to convince a number of international investors to invest in that fund, and that fund then invested in equity markets here in Mongolia. So this was, I think, my first achievement when it comes to Mongolia. We also realized that the capital markets in Mongolia are at the infancy stage, and I worked in a number of investment banks, both global banks like Credit Suisse was Boston, and emerging market focused ones like Renaissance Capital. And so that experience led me to conclusion that there's an opportunity here in Mongolia for development of investment banking industry.
Yes. How large is the fund now?
The fund basically is we invest not only in Mongolia but also in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, also Russia, China. Overall, we manage over $100 million under management.
$100 million. And how many part of it invested in Mongolia?
We have invested 20% of this in Mongolia.
20%. So about $20 million are invested thanks to you, to your effort, to your that decisions 3 years ago.
Yes, this is directly through our fund management business. And if we take into account another business in which I have been involved, I have founded Евроази Capital, which is one of the leading investment companies here, and involved in brokerage business, providing access to Mongolian equity market to international investors.
So let's talk about, you were comparing Kazakhstan with Mongolia, even the real estate price opportunities that time, 1995, Kazakhstan was facing, and then a very short period, very strong growth. Please share with our audience why you think Mongolia can go that fast as Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan and Mongolia are, I think they have a lot in common. Both these countries have massive territories. They're relatively sparsely populated. These two nations share common history. Both countries have massive, extensive natural resources, and in both cases, these resources are largely undeveloped. Both of them next to China, which is the largest consumer of natural resources. And both countries, I think, in this wider region, have been more successful than others in introducing economic reforms. So obviously Kazakhstan started earlier, and so that's why you could see what has happened there. And one of the things that you referred to was that Kazakhstan in between 2002 to 2007 had 5 years of very high growth rates. So it has reflected in everything you see there in Kazakhstan, in terms of the GDP growth rates, in terms of what you see in terms of infrastructure, the real estate boom, also boom in the equity markets there. And I'm a firm believer that Mongolia will go through the same boom period here, whether it's in real estate, whether it's the Mongolian equities market, whether it's attracting a lot of foreign investments in this country. We're already seeing this.
Let's talk a little bit about the property, real estate property. The price, obviously you remember that last year we have overbuilt in a way, beyond the demand. And then we had a large number of empty apartments. And yet we have half of population of the city looking for apartment.
Yes.
How do you see that, and what is the next in this industry?
I think what will happen going forward, and starting from 2011, the key to development of property sector is the degree of development of financial services industry, commercial banks. Here in Mongolia, commercial banks are, in our view, are undercapitalized. As a result, they cannot be active, and so far it has been proven the case. They haven't been active in providing mortgages to Mongolians. And if you look obviously to experience of Kazakhstan, Russia, Ukraine, and other emerging markets, banks have played an important role in providing affordable financing in the form of mortgages to people that would like to buy.
Why Mongolia is not able to do that? Why money is so expensive in this country? Why the economy is so much underbanked, to your view?
I think there are a number of reasons. Number one was that the banking sector in Mongolia grew organically. It's mostly owned by, as you know, Mongolian banking system has been fully privatized. Mm-hmm. And as mostly all 14 banks are owned by various private businesses and private individuals. Now, the shareholders of the banks, they don't have capacity to properly capitalize the banks.
Why?
Well, because again,
knowledge issue, or what is that about? Why they would not do it?
If you go back all the way to 100 years, 150 years, when the banks appeared in U.S., most of the banks were privately held. And this was done through partnerships. And then there was a process of equitization of the banks, and the founders of the banks attracted foreign outside investors. And then the next logical step was to list the shares of these banks in stock exchanges. And this has led to active development of the banking system in the United States. And as a result, you had the emergence of J.P. Morgans and Citis. And the same thing has happened in other countries. And so therefore, we go back to this point of you need fresh equity, fresh money coming to the banking system. And one of the best ways to do it for the current owners of the banks in Mongolia to attract outside investors. And then list the shares of Mongolian banks at the Mongolian Stock Exchange as a first phase. And the next logical step would be for some of the bigger Mongolian banks to go to do IPO internationally. So if you go back to the recent history in Kazakhstan, one of the reasons that the Kazakhstan economy grew very fast, not only because of oil, which was obviously a big factor, but it was very much to do with the success that the Kazakh banks had in attracting capital from outside of Kazakhstan.
They have listed abroad.
Correct.
There are certain requirements probably for that, and our banks tried 2 banks here domestically. Mm-hmm. But probably the other banks will try internationally.
Yes.
If it is the case, that will be a good gate of capital to Mongolia.
Absolutely. If you look at what already, I think there's already a number of positive trends happening. Trade Development Bank successfully completed its Eurobond when they raised 150 million.
150 million.
So this is already, I think, a big will have impact on the banking system here, because not only it allows bank to lend more, but it also allows bank to reduce interest rates. You ask why the money is expensive. Because the capital
shortage of total capital.
Correct. So if you have more capital to come to banking system, not only you have wider availability of capital and through loans, mortgages, but also the lower costs.
So the Mongolian commercial private banks are to go abroad to the major stock exchange to raise fund.
I think the first phase, I think, should be for some of these banks to start listing here locally, because we work on a daily basis with investors. And you may also know that our firm has developed an equity index for Mongolia, which includes not only companies that are listed at Mongolia Stock Exchange, but also Mongolia-focused companies listed internationally in places like London, Toronto, New York,
These mining
Hong Kong.
companies?
Yes, it's mostly mining companies.
Yes.
So obviously, as anyone thinks about...
What is this equity index about? They measure, what do they measure?
So this index allows investors to have a benchmark, and benchmark means that when they want to invest into Mongolia, they want to know how these investments are performing. So if, for example, Dow Jones, you look in the morning, the announcer would say that Dow Jones was up 1%, as investors feel more comfortable, more confident about the U.S. economy. And so we have MSCI Top 20 Index, which reflects what the performance of the shares that are listed in Mongolia Stock Exchange, but there is no index that provides you a tool to assess performance of companies that are listed outside of Mongolia. So like Ivanhoe Mines, Mongolia Mining Corporation, and others.
So what would it show the investors' sense on the events happening in Mongolia and their reflection on the total market value?
The market share of any company that's listed outside of Mongolia and with the companies that they have assets in Mongolia is a reflection of investor sentiments, their view of where this company is going, and obviously the fortune of that company linked to what's happening to Mongolia. So as a result, what my point is that when people invest in Mongolia-related companies, it's 99%, and this index demonstrates this. 99% of all the companies that are linked to Mongolia are mining and resource companies. So therefore, investors, and we have seen many of them coming here and looking actively at non-resource and non-mining types of investments. And banking would be one of this type of industry, which would be very attractive to investors. So coming back to the point, so why there is shortage of capital in banking system, I think I found it is quite puzzling, because at one side you see the demand from Mongolians for mortgages, and banks cannot meet that demand. At the same time, you have investors that want to invest in outside and beyond mining, and yet none of the banks are listed their shares.
They are not connected in a certain way.
So if someone, a big manager, fund manager from Hong Kong or from London comes to Mongolia and say, I would like to invest in shares of the bank, he cannot do it because none of the banks are listed. And so as a result, I think this is fundamental.
How about creating a new bank?
Well, it's possible, but obviously it's going to be up to central bank to decide to issue new licenses. But I think we already have...
Isn't not the reason why, maybe central bank is not issuing new licenses?
Well, I think the central bank, the reason why they're not issuing the licenses...
Either the Mongolian banks capitalize more, or they issue a new license.
Well, I think right now the thinking of central bank is that we have 14 banks, and most of the banks, other than 3 big or 4 banks, are quite small. So instead of issuing new licenses, why don't we let these banks either to merge or attract more capital and
That's
grow?
what we are waiting for the last 15 years.
I know.
Maybe the psychology of Mongolian owners of banks, we have very little experience with merging.
I think it's challenging, but I think the 2011 could be crucial for banking system.
Either you do or you behind.
Yes.
What do you think about this Mongolian Development Bank?
I think
state-owned.
I think for Mongolia, with its enormous requirements for infrastructure investments and industrialization program that the government has envisioned, there is a big role for such institution.
Okay, so you think it is one of the things we should do?
Absolutely.
Because commercial banks, first, cannot do this size. Second, too expensive. Third, as your reason, there is a closed channel for outside investors, right?
And if you go back to every single major emerging country, such as Korea, for example, even Japan back in 50s and 60s, one of the key things that they have done, they set up the government-owned development banks.
On the other hand, would not it will make the government even larger?
Well, I think when it comes to big investments in infrastructure, other than having the PPP models, which are the public-private partnerships, which I think should be encouraged, but there will be still so many areas where government has to step in and provide funding, because private sector will have many other things to deal with. And again, there will be lack of capital, there will be other issues. So as a result, again, like if you look at Korea and Japan, which I think is also important experience that you can draw from lessons, these two countries, as they were going through industrialization drive, they had government that was at the driving seat. And obviously private sector was involved very actively too. But these development banks were key to channel much needed capital into infrastructure projects.
Does it mean that all major public investment through infrastructure, etc., go through the bank?
It may be other forms, but I think there is much needed role for such a bank to play a meaningful role in government-led infrastructure projects.
Okay, let's touch a little bit, not very particular necessarily banking sector. We Mongolians are proud of saying we have big country, large territory, a lot cattle, animals, but yet we, for example, import almost half of our milk consumption from abroad. How do you see the solution? How come in that way?
It's again goes back to the fact that you have limited capital domestically, and as a result, you don't have well-developed processing industries. But this is something that can be addressed and successfully tackled. And I mean, go back to again Russia. So anyone that lived in Russia early 90s, they know huge lines for bread, huge lines for milk, because the state-owned dairy industry was destroyed after the break of the Soviet Union. And
as we did here.
But then obviously what happened is that people start to build a small line, and then they brought the Tetra Pak production. They got a very expensive loan from a local bank, and after one step after another, they start to develop. And you know that Wimbledon, which was built like this, I remember when I used to work at Renaissance Capital, Wimbledon was a very small company with only one factory. And as you probably saw in the headlines, just a few weeks ago, PepsiCo made the decision to buy Wimbledon for $3.5 billion. And Wimbledon has emerged as the biggest dairy and juice producer. And I think these type of success stories can be replicated here in Mongolia.
Yeah, still we have a lot of family-owned companies. That family or the owner himself has run in businesses for many years, and somehow it doesn't happen. It is not going to mature somehow in Mongolia. And to me, people come to be a politician, which is a very disturbing signal for businesses when the businessman goes to be a politician. What do you think about that? Obviously, you know the country. You know many people are doing that.
I guess it's a part of this, maturing the country in terms of both businesses and the political system. I mean, from experience of other countries, it's not unusual for businessmen to go into politics, and obviously it happens here quite often. But coming back to what you discuss, what are the obstacles for private sector development?
Exactly. And what we can do to improve that?
I think one of the principal issues is access to capital. And and if you have access to capital, and then you have the introducing corporate governance principles, where you bring a management team in place, you bring outside investors, you introduce the financial reportings, and this is the co-foundation for successful business. And I think this is something that there's a number of businesses here in Mongolia already going through, and so this is a very encouraging sign for me.
And yet we have more and more companies inviting the international rating companies to come, right?
This is part of the process, because if you want to bring outside investor, or you want to raise money from borrow a loan from a bank or international bank, they want to know, what is your credibility, your creditworthiness.
From the third point of view, yeah?
From a third party.
Are you familiar with the government plan about Tavan Tolghe, about the call, and they now announcing the tender for operator, etc.? How do you see all this process?
Tavan Tolghe, as everyone knows in Mongolia, is a crown jewel asset for Mongolians. So that's why everyone, I think, has a very strong interest in knowing what's happening. And Tavan Tolghe indeed is a unique asset, a big mine. A lot of mining companies around the world, they just would love to be partner of a Mongolian government to operate and to own this mine. As you know, there has been changes in the government thinking over the last several years how to best structure the deal to develop this mine. First, it was to sell 49% stake to our partner. Then, in February this year, the government announced that they're going to maintain 100% ownership, and they're going to introduce so-called contract mining. And so, if you look at the experience of other countries that are rich in coal resources, such as Indonesia, this so-called contract mining, it has been successfully introduced. And so therefore...
Basically what ownership is with the government.
Yes.
The other companies come and contractually operating.
Yes.
The mine and sells the product as well?
Yes.
The operating company.
You could do integrated approach where a contractor is also responsible for marketing, or you can split into the operational side and then the marketing side. And there are plenty of globally big traders that would love to have offtake agreement.
What is the best scenario for Mongolia?
Well, I think what has been articulated earlier this year, where the government basically attracts this experienced operator, then this is on the operational side. But when it comes to ownership, I think the recently announced plans to distribute shares in Tavan Tolghe to population, it's kind of in preferred shares, 10%. I think this is a very good idea, because this will be in one move introduce so-called, in US they call it equity culture, experience of owning shares. And this is very important, I think, because as you may know, 60% of Americans own shares, either directly or through mutual funds. And the shares represent quite an important part of their wealth, a personal wealth. And I think...
and a responsibility.
And also instills the responsibility, obviously. And so if Mongolian government does distribute the shares, I think it would be very important, because then everyone will have...
You said the preferred shares.
Well, preferred shares, which, there is a distinction between common shares and preferred shares. It's a very technical issue.
Yeah, but common shares, you are really a shareholder, you have a voting right.
Yes.
With preferred shares, you don't have voting right, but you will be paid first.
Yes, you will.
Then common dividends, right?
Correct.
Shares.
So you have dividends flows that are guaranteed.
Yes.
And
maybe, well, in terms of return, maybe it's better option than common shares even for people.
Again, this is a technical issue that the government needs to resolve. But I think that in terms of, if you look at this from a point of view, allowing Mongolians directly have ownership in Tavan Tolgoi, I think this is a very crucial policy issue.
Yeah, but with Tavan Tolgoi, we talk about new power stations, we talk about infrastructure, railroad. Altogether, it will demand over $7 billion
Yes.
investment.
Correct.
And after this investment's return, paid completely, then you talk about the issue of giving dividend back to shareholders. It will take a long time, no?
Well, again, it's development of Mongolian natural resources. This is not a 1, 2, 3, 5 year period. We're talking
Yes.
about decades.
That's I just wanted you tell that it is not the issue that they got share and next day they got money as well.
If you look
It's
at
equity
it,
culture
it is equity culture.
and knowledge. Yeah.
You need to. You have to have a situation where Mongolians, they will own the shares, they will benefit from the value increase, because you may not get the dividend next year, but if your share price go up 20, 30, 50% a year, you feel rich, more rich.
Yes.
This is how Americans feel. This is how everyone that invests in public equities and shares, that's how they feel. You don't need to sell, or you don't need to specifically receive dividends every year. If the markets are doing well, and I'm a firm believer that the markets, equity markets in Mongolia will do extremely well.
Well, you are one of Mongolian-based companies, along with the government, who is looking forward very optimistic way, and I think it was economy triples during the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And with this growth, do you think it's realistic?
I think so. It's what you have is a country that only has $5 billion GDP, which is the results of 2009. I think it's a very low number. So you're starting with a very low base.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these big projects like Oy Tolgoi and Tavan Tolgoi, which are world-class, important, big projects. And so if once these projects start to develop, they will have a very significant positive impact on the GDP growth rates, the economic growth rates. So we at our firm have calculated or made the projections that the GDP, the economy of Mongolia will grow at the rate of 20% per annum for the next 10 years. And this will allow the country to be the fastest growing economy in the world, faster than any other oil-rich countries. And so therefore, these type of positive outlooks are based on our vigorous analysis of different investment projects and the resources that we expect will be developed over the next decade. And that's why I'm here telling you Mongolia is going to grow very fast. And as we had a conversation recently with the representative from the central bank, the central bank would be the only institution to worry about how to avoid overheating.
Great. So with this note, let this plan come true,
Okay.
and let our business, whoever is doing in Mongolia, prosperous. And let's think for triple economy in 5 years.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Таны төлөө эх орн чинь юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуухаас өмнө та өөрөө эх орныхон төлөө юу хийж чадах вэ гэж асуу. Young for Jargal.